What's up, everybody? I'm Mike Dwyer from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today we're taking a look at the 5 biggest mistakes I see people making when recording guitars in their home studio. So I spend a lot of time mixing tracks that were recorded by bands in their home studios, and I see a lot of bands making the same mistakes when it comes to recording guitars. I put this list together of some of the most common ones, so you can avoid them the next time you record guitars. Mistake number 1, not tuning enough. Unless your guitar has an Evertune bridge on it, I can almost guarantee you're not tuning enough. Tuning once and then doing a full pass of the song is almost certainly not going to cut it. It might sound close enough on its own, but once you double your rhythm tracks, add in your lead guitars and bass parts, with the tunings of each of those parts slowly drifting, by the time you make it to the second verse, things are going to start to sound pretty wonky. A lot of the time, I'll have guitarists stop and tune up after almost every section of the song. It only takes a tiny bit longer, but makes a huge difference to the sound of your tracks. And a little bonus tip while we're on the topic of tuning. Tune how you play. Guitars are really finicky instruments, and pretty much everything affects the tuning. So if the part you're recording is played with hard, constant strumming, that's how you should tune it too. If you tune how most people do, just a nice gentle wrung out note, when you play it for real and you're digging in and constantly strumming, your guitar is going to sound sharp. So always tune how you're going to play the part. Moving on to mistake number 2, not getting your parts tight enough. This is going to sound really obvious, but you have to play your parts well. I think a lot of the time, guitarists will just do a full take of the song, top to bottom, say, yeah, that felt pretty okay, and move on. If you're playing the first verse and you either flub something a little bit or a part just felt a tiny bit off, stop right then and there, re-record the verse. When you do a full take, there's no way you'll remember everything that felt a bit off. And even if you listen back, you'll be likely to miss something. So just fix it as you go, and you'll end up with much cleaner, tighter tracks. And another bonus tip related to this, double each section right away. This is especially important when you're recording a newly written or recently modified part, but if you record the left chorus guitar and then immediately record the double, you're much more likely to play it exactly the same than if you make your way through the whole song doing guitar left before going back and playing the double. And now for mistake number 3, not changing your strings before recording. Look, guitar strings are like $5. Just buy a new pack before you record. It'll sound a lot better. And I think this is even more important for bass, both because your bass strings are probably 30 years old at this point, but even if they're only a few weeks or a month old or something, changing to a fresh set can take your bass tone from pretty decent to great. And yeah, bass strings are like $20. I get that it's not the most fun thing to spend money on, but you're already recording at home, so you're saving a ton of money there by not booking a studio. So use a little bit of the money you saved there to get yourself a fresh pack of strings. And I can already hear some of you saying that worn-in strings sound better or are your sound or whatever. And yes, for certain styles and sounds, slightly worn-in strings can sound better. But if you're playing something like pop punk or hardcore or modern rock or whatever, just get the new strings. Hey, I just want to take a quick second to tell you about the sponsor of this video, my mixing course. If you're sick of mixing courses where the raw tracks sound 10 times better than your final mixes, I feel ya. I'd get so frustrated when I'd buy a course only to hear them say something like, yeah, the guitars were recorded perfectly, so I didn't have to do anything to them. Or the drums already sounded great, so I just barely touched them. As someone who wasn't working with perfectly recorded tracks at the time, this felt like a giant waste of time and money. So when I decided to make a course, I wanted to do the exact opposite. I took one of the very first recordings I ever did in my first home studio and remixed that to show you that you can make killer mixes, even when the raw tracks are far from ideal. You can head on over to bettermixes.com/fixitinthemix to learn more. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Mistake number 4, not cleaning up your tracks. So there's a couple parts to this, but the one I see people do most often is forgetting to put crossfades between edit points or punch points. I get tracks all the time that have tiny little clicks in the guitars everywhere where they punched in a part. Just make sure you go through and toss a little fade on all of your edits. It'll take you 1 minute and will help prevent your mixing engineer from ripping their hair out. The other part of this is chopping out any random unwanted noises between notes. Especially if you have any short choppy parts or muted chug parts or something. Cutting out all the extra crud that sneaks in there can make your track sound a lot more polished. Just remember to add fades after you're done. And finally, mistake number 5, not dialing in intentional tones for each guitar part. I think a lot of the time, guitarists will just dial in their usual amp settings that they use live, or just bring up their go-to amp sim and just record all the parts without putting much thought into it. And for some songs, that might be totally fine. But just make sure you're being intentional about it. As you get to each new part, just take a minute and think, is this the best tone for this part? For instance, maybe in the chorus, you're really digging into a big chunky rhythm part, so you dial in your amp for an equally massive tone. But then you get to the verse where you're just holding out a chord on each bar. Good chance you don't need it to sound as massive. Maybe dialing the gain down or pulling back on the low end or something will work better for that part. Or maybe even changing amps or amp sims entirely to get a totally different sound. Same thing with when you get to lead guitars. Most likely the tone you dialed in for your rhythm part isn't going to be the best for your leads. So like I said, just be intentional about it and actually take the time to think about your tone for each part. And one final bonus mistake, not recording a DI track. I have a whole video about why you should always record a DI track, so I won't get too deep into it now. I'll link the video up here if you want to check it out. But the short of it is, a DI track can really save your butt. If you end up needing to do any editing with a DI is infinitely easier than trying to edit super distorted guitars where the waveform basically just looks like a brick. Plus, it gives you the option to reamp later, just in case the tones you dialed in just aren't working in the mix as well as you thought they would. So I hope this video will help you improve your guitar recordings. If you liked any of the tips given, I'd really appreciate it if you click that thumbs up button and subscribe. Also, be sure to head on over to bettermixes.com to discover your new favorite drum samples, to learn more about my mixing course and one-on-one coaching, to get free mixing guides, and a whole lot more.